January 17, 1946, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The winter sun breaks pale and cold over the pine forests of northern Louisiana. In the distance, the low hum of a diesel generator cuts through the morning stillness. Behind chain-link fencing topped with coils of barbed wire, rows of wooden barracks stand in neat formation, their tar-paper roofs still glistening with overnight frost. Smoke rises from a central mess hall, carrying with it something unfamiliar to the women housed in Compound C. The rich, buttery smell of eggs being scrambled in real cream, seasoned with pepper and salt that isn't rationed, cooked in pans that aren't scraped clean from years of deprivation. Inside Barrack 7, Greta Hoffman sits upright on her narrow cot, her breath visible in the unheated room. She is 23 years old, though her face carries the weariness of someone much older. Her hands, calloused from 2 years working in a munitions factory outside Dresden, rest folded in her lap. She wears the same gray wool dress she wore when she was processed through the gates 3 weeks earlier, the same dress she wore when American forces liberated, or captured, depending on perspective, the administrative staff of a labor coordination office in Bavaria. The distinction between perpetrator and victim, between willing participant and conscripted functionary, has become the subject of careful documentation by the Allied authorities. But on this particular morning, Greta Hoffman is not thinking about documentation. She is thinking about breakfast. The door to the barrack opens. A guard, an American corporal named Jenkins with a soft Mississippi drawl, announces that mess call is in 10 minutes. The women rise slowly, wrapping themselves in whatever additional layers they possess. They move toward the mess hall in a quiet column, their breath forming small clouds in the air. None of them speak. They have learned, in the weeks since their arrival, that speech invites questions, and questions require explanations that do not translate well across the ruins of a fallen empire. This moment, this ordinary January morning in a prisoner-of-war camp deep in the American South, represents something far more complex than the simple detention of enemy nationals. It marks the beginning of a profound ideological rupture, a crack in the foundation of everything these women had been taught to believe about the world, about their enemies, and about themselves. The weapon that would widen this crack was not propaganda, not re-education lectures, not the stern moralizing of victorious powers. It was scrambled eggs. To understand what happened at Camp Ruston in the winter of 1946, one must first understand what these women had left behind. The Germany they knew in the final years of the war was a nation consuming itself. By 1944, the average caloric intake for German civilians had fallen to approximately 1,200 calories per day in urban areas, well below the threshold required for sustained physical labor. The ration card system, once presented as a marvel of organized efficiency by the Reich, had collapsed into a black market lottery where connections mattered more than loyalty. Bread was adulterated with sawdust and potato peel. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and chicory root bore no resemblance to the beverage it claimed to replace. Meat had become a memory preserved only in the stories elderly Germans told about the time before the First War. Greta Hoffman had not tasted real eggs in 3 years. The last time she saw a whole egg, untainted by preservation chemicals or stretching agents, was in the spring of 1943, a gift from her grandmother's neighbor who kept chickens hidden in a cellar. That egg had been divided among 5 people. In the final year of the war, even the ersatz foods became scarce. The women working in factories received supplemental rations, but these supplements consisted mostly of turnips and beets, the same vegetables that had sustained Germany through the hunger winter of 1917. The propaganda posters showed smiling German women contributing to the war effort, their cheeks rosy with health and patriotic fervor. The reality was hollow faces, swollen joints from malnutrition, and the persistent gnawing hunger that became as familiar as breathing. When the Americans arrived in Bavaria in April 1945, They brought with them logistical capabilities that defied comprehension. Greta watched as convoys of trucks rolled through her town, each vehicle larger than any she had ever seen, their beds loaded with crates marked in English. She watched as American soldiers casually discarded half-eaten rations, food that would have fed her family for a week, into waste bins. She watched as the Americans set up field kitchens that produced meals in quantities that seemed physically impossible. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the rubble of her town, and despite everything, despite the defeat, despite the shame, despite the growing awareness of what had been done in Germany's name, that smell triggered something primal and undeniable. The women who ended up at Camp Rustin were not SS guards or concentration camp administrators. They were clerks, telephone operators, factory workers, women who had kept the machinery of the Reich functioning in small, bureaucratic ways. The American military government classified them as Category Roman IV, followers, not perpetrators. They would be detained for processing, documentation, and eventual release, but they were not considered war criminals in the strictest sense. This distinction mattered legally, but it mattered little to the women themselves, who understood that in the eyes of the world, they carried the collective guilt of a nation that had unleashed horrors beyond measure. They expected punishment. They expected harsh conditions, meager rations, perhaps brutality. They had heard stories, rumors that circulated through the refugee columns and displaced persons camps, about what happened to German prisoners in Soviet hands. They had been told by the final broadcasts of the crumbling Reich that the Americans and British would exact terrible revenge, that German women would be subjected to the same treatment that had been inflicted upon the conquered populations of Europe. When they were loaded onto trucks and then onto trains, when they crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship, when they arrived at Camp Rustin and saw the guard towers and barbed wire, they prepared themselves for the worst. What they found instead was scrambled eggs. The mess hall at Camp Rustin was a long, rectangular building with exposed rafters and rows of tables that could seat 200 people. Industrial ceiling fans hung motionless in the winter air. The floor was concrete, swept clean each morning by a rotating detail of prisoners. At one end of the hall, a serving line had been set up with the efficiency characteristic of American military operations. Large aluminum trays sat in steam tables, their contents visible to anyone who approached. The women formed a line, each holding a metal tray divided into compartments, each moving forward with the practiced shuffle of people accustomed to institutional feeding. Greta reached the serving station. An American soldier, an older man with sergeant stripes and tired eyes, stood behind the counter. He did not smile, but neither did he scowl. He simply scooped food onto her tray with mechanical precision. First, a serving of scrambled eggs, yellow and fluffy, steaming slightly in the cool air. Then 2 strips of bacon, crispy and dark. Then a slice of white bread, already buttered. Then a ladleful of oatmeal, thick and sweetened with brown sugar. Finally, a small carton of milk, cold and whole. Greta stared at her tray. She could not move. Behind her, another woman bumped into her gently, urging her forward. She found a seat at one of the long tables, placed her tray down, and continued to stare. Around her, other women sat in similar silence, confronting the same cognitive dissonance. This was not punishment. This was not even adequate sustenance. This was abundance. She picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly. She scooped a small portion of the scrambled eggs and brought it to her mouth. The taste was overwhelming, not because it was exotic or strange, but because it was so utterly ordinary, so completely normal, so reminiscent of a world that no longer existed. The eggs were rich with butter, seasoned properly, cooked to a texture that required attention and care. They were not stretched with water or adulterated with substitutes. They were simply eggs, prepared the way eggs were meant to be prepared, in a place where eggs were plentiful enough that one need not think about their scarcity. She ate slowly, savoring each bite not out of pleasure but out of disbelief. She ate the bacon, tasting salt and smoke and fat in proportions her body had nearly forgotten. She ate the bread, marveling at its softness, at the fact that it was made from refined white flour rather than the coarse, dark mixtures she had known for years. She drank the milk, cold and sweet, and felt it coat her throat with a richness that bordered on obscene. When she finished, she remained seated. Other women around her were crying quietly, their tears falling into empty trays. No one spoke. The enormity of what they were experiencing could not be captured in words. For 2 years they had been told that Germany's enemies were decadent, weak, corrupted by material excess and racial mixing. They had been told that Germany's strength lay in its discipline, its willingness to sacrifice, its purity of purpose. They had been told that they were fighting against nations that had grown soft and vulnerable, that the Reich's ultimate victory was inevitable because Germany alone possessed the will to endure hardship. And now they sat in an American prison camp, eating scrambled eggs that represented a level of abundance they had never known even before the war, and the lie revealed itself with a clarity that no propaganda could obscure. If this was how America fed its prisoners, how did it feed its citizens? If this was the excess that remained after fighting a two-front war across 2 oceans, what did true American abundance look like? The historical record of prisoner of war camps in the United States during and immediately after World War II reveals a logistical operation of staggering scale. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States detained approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners on American soil, housed in over 500 camps distributed across every region of the country. These prisoners were predominantly German, with smaller numbers of Italian and Japanese detainees. The camps were administered under the rules established by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which stipulated that prisoners must receive rations equivalent to those provided to garrison troops of the detaining power. This stipulation, intended to prevent abuse, had an unintended consequence when applied to American detention facilities. The United States military in 1945 was the best-fed fighting force in human history. American soldiers received approximately 4,000 calories per day, with rations designed to include fresh meat, dairy, vegetables, and fruits whenever possible. The K-ration, the standard field ration for American troops, contained chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned meat, biscuits, and fruit bars, luxuries that exceeded the civilian diets of most European nations. When these standards were applied to POW camps, the result was that Axis prisoners in American custody ate better than they had at any point during the war, and in many cases, better than they had eaten in their entire lives. Camp Ruston, established in 1942 in Lincoln Parish, Louisiana, initially housed German prisoners captured in North Africa and later Italy. By 1946, it had been partially converted to hold civilian detainees awaiting repatriation or further processing. The camp's kitchen facilities, designed to feed thousands, operated with the industrial efficiency that characterized American logistics. Flour arrived in 100-pound sacks. Eggs came in crates containing 30 dozen. Meat was delivered in refrigerated trucks twice weekly. The camp's records, preserved in the National Archives, show monthly food requisitions that would have sustained a small town. A report filed by the camp commander in February 1946 noted an unusual phenomenon. Several German women detained in Compound C had formally requested extensions of their detention. They did not wish to return to Germany. When questioned about their reasoning, they cited fear of starvation, concern about the Soviet occupation zone, and anxiety about the lack of infrastructure in their home regions. But in the private conversations recorded by camp administrators, and in the letters these women wrote to family members still in Europe, a different truth emerged. They did not want to leave because they had, for the first time in years, enough to eat. One letter, written by a woman named Ilse Becker and intercepted by military censors, described her experience. "We receive 3 meals each day. Real meals, not the thin soups and dry bread we knew at home. Yesterday we had chicken roasted with herbs. Can you imagine? Chicken. and not one bird divided among many, but enough that each woman received a full portion. The Americans waste more food in a single day than we saw in a month. I do not understand how they do this. I do not understand where it all comes from. Another detainee, Marguerite Scalls, wrote, "I am afraid to go back. Here I am gaining weight. My hands no longer shake from hunger. I sleep through the night without waking from the pain in my stomach. I know we are prisoners. I know we have been defeated. But I am eating better than I ever did when we were told we were winning." The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. These women had spent their adult lives in a totalitarian state that demanded absolute loyalty in exchange for promises of security, prosperity, and national greatness. The Nazi regime had presented itself as the culmination of German civilization, a system so efficient and scientifically organized that it would usher in a 1,000-year Reich of order and plenty. The reality had been famine, destruction, and death. And now, in defeat, they were being fed by the very people who had destroyed their country, fed better than their own government had ever managed. The eggs became symbolic. In the conversations that developed among the women in Compound C, in the quiet discussions that took place in the barracks after lights out, the eggs represented something larger than protein and calories. They represented a fundamental truth about systems, about governance, about the relationship between states and citizens. The Third Reich had demanded everything and delivered nothing. The American system, even to its enemies, provided abundance almost as an afterthought. Greta Hoffmann began to experience what psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance at a profound level. She had believed, or at least had allowed herself to believe, that the deprivation she experienced was necessary sacrifice for a greater good. She had accepted the propaganda that portrayed Germany as encircled by enemies, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. She had internalized the message that suffering was noble, that hardship built character, that the German people's willingness to endure proved their superiority. But scrambled eggs did not require an ideology to explain them. They simply existed, abundant and available, in a place where she was supposed to be punished. The cognitive framework that had sustained her through years of propaganda began to crack, not because someone lectured her about democracy or freedom, but because her body, fed properly for the first time in years, could not deny the evidence of its own experience. She began to pay attention to other details. The American guards rotated shifts on a regular schedule. They did not appear malnourished. Their uniforms were well maintained, replaced when worn. They had access to medical care, evident from the way minor injuries were treated promptly. They seemed, for the most part, unburdened by the haunted desperation that had characterized the final months of German military personnel. They did not loot, did not confiscate personal belongings beyond what security required, did not engage in the casual brutalities that had become routine in the collapsing Reich. The camp had a small library, stocked with books in German that had been deemed appropriate for re-education purposes. But it also had magazines, American publications translated into German, showing photographs of American cities untouched by bombing, American farms producing surplus grain, American factories operating at full capacity. The women looked at these images with skepticism at first, assuming them to be propaganda. But the scrambled eggs suggested otherwise. If the propaganda were lies, they were lies so elaborate and well-resourced that they manifested as material reality in quantities that defied fabrication. There was a woman in Compound C named Anna Drescher who had been a true believer. At 41, she was older than most of the detainees, and she had joined the National Socialist Women's League in 1934 out of genuine ideological conviction. She had organized community drives, distributed propaganda materials, and reported neighbors suspected of disloyalty. When the war began, she volunteered for factory work, then for administrative duties in the labor allocation office. She had never wavered in her faith that Germany was fighting a righteous war against inferior peoples who sought to destroy Germanic civilization. Anna refused to eat the scrambled eggs. For the first 3 days at Camp Ruston, she ate only the bread and drank only water. She told the other women that accepting the enemy's food was a form of collaboration, that it demonstrated weakness and lack of character. She quoted speeches she had memorized, rhetoric about blood and soil and the eternal struggle of the German Volk. The other women listened politely at first, then with growing irritation, and finally with silence. On the fourth day, Anna fainted during morning roll call. She was taken to the camp infirmary where an American doctor examined her. He spoke to her in careful German, explained that she was suffering from malnutrition, and told her that she would be required to eat or she would be fed intravenously. She protested. He listened, then simply provided her with a tray of food and left the room. Anna stared at the food for 2 hours. Eventually she ate. When she returned to the barracks, she did not speak for several days. The other women left her alone. They understood that something inside her had broken, some essential structure that had given her life meaning and purpose. She had predicated her entire existence on the assumption that the Reich represented ultimate truth, and that truth had been revealed as hollow. The scrambled eggs had accomplished what no re-education program could have achieved. They had demonstrated, through simple material fact, that everything she believed was false. Anna began to change. She asked questions. She read the materials in the camp library. She spoke to the younger women, particularly to Greta, and confessed that she felt as though she were waking from a long sleep. She said the metaphor was inadequate, that it was more like realizing she had been watching shadows on a cave wall while insisting the shadows were reality itself. She said the eggs had done this, and she knew how absurd it sounded, but it was true. The eggs and the bacon and the white bread and the milk, the sheer, undeniable material abundance of it all. The American military government had not planned for this psychological effect. The goal of providing adequate rations to prisoners was humanitarian and practical. Healthy prisoners were easier to manage and less likely to become ill or rebellious. But the secondary effect, the ideological impact of abundance on people who had known only scarcity, became apparent to the camp administrators as they processed the extension requests and read the intercepted letters. A military psychologist assigned to Camp Ruston, Captain David Brennan, wrote a report in March 1946 that was later filed with the Department of War. In it, he noted, "The detainees exhibit signs of profound ideological reorientation, triggered not by exposure to democratic principles in the abstract, but by concrete experience of material conditions that contradict their previous worldview. Many express shame at how easily their beliefs have been challenged by something as mundane as adequate food. They use words like seduced and corrupted, but it is clear that what they are experiencing is not corruption, but rather the dissolution of false consciousness. They have lived under a system that promised greatness and delivered misery, and now they exist, however temporarily, within a system that promises little but delivers abundance. The contrast is too stark to rationalize away." Captain Brennan's observations were echoed by other personnel working in POW camps across the United States. A chaplain at a camp in Texas noted that German prisoners frequently asked him to explain how America could produce so much. They wanted to understand the mechanisms, the systems, the organizational principles that allowed for this level of prosperity. When he tried to explain concepts like free markets, property rights, and democratic governance, they struggled to connect these abstractions to the concrete reality of full plates and heated barracks. The truth was that American abundance in 1946 was the result of factors both systematic and fortunate. The United States had not been bombed. Its infrastructure remained intact. Its agricultural sector had actually expanded during the war years. Its industrial capacity had been fully mobilized without the destruction that had ravaged Europe and Asia. But beyond these material factors was something more fundamental, a political and economic system that, despite its flaws and contradictions, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that totalitarian systems could not match. The Third Reich had been organized around principles of autarky, racial hierarchy, and militaristic expansion. It had extracted wealth from conquered territories and enslaved populations, but it had never developed sustainable systems of production and distribution. The command economy of Nazi Germany was riddled with inefficiencies, corruption, and competing bureaucracies. Resources were allocated based on ideological priorities rather than practical need. The result was a nation that could build sophisticated weapons but could not feed its people, that could wage war across a continent but could not maintain basic infrastructure. The United States, by contrast, had stumbled into superpower status almost by accident, through a combination of geographic isolation, abundant natural resources, immigrant labor, and institutional frameworks that, however imperfectly, allowed for innovation and adaptation. The scrambled eggs at Camp Rustin were not propaganda. They were simply the downstream result of a system that worked better than the alternative. By April 1946, word of the conditions at American POW camps had begun to spread through occupied Germany. Letters from detainees reached family members. Rumors circulated in displaced persons camps. German civilians, living in the ruins of their cities, struggling with ration levels that had actually decreased since the end of the war, heard stories about German prisoners in America who were gaining weight, who had access to medical care, who lived in heated barracks and ate 3 meals a day. The Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany presented a stark contrast. Conditions there were harsh, deliberately so in many cases. Food rations were minimal. Labor was compulsory and brutal. The Soviet administration viewed German civilians as collectively guilty and showed little inclination toward mercy. Refugees fleeing westward brought stories of starvation and abuse. The comparison between American and Soviet treatment of Germans became a source of strategic concern for Allied planners, who realized that the material conditions in their respective zones would shape German attitudes toward the emerging Cold War ideological divide. Greta Hoffman's sister, still living in the British occupation zone, received a letter in May describing conditions at Camp Rustin. The letter had been approved by military censors and included no classified information. It simply described daily life, the work assignments, the rations, the medical care, the relative freedom within the compound. Greta's sister showed the letter to her neighbors, and within days dozens of people had read it. The reaction was complex, envy, certainly, but also a kind of bitter vindication. They had suffered for nothing. They had sacrificed for a regime that had given them only rhetoric while their enemies lived in comfort. Inside Camp Rustin, the extension requests continued. By summer, over 60 women had formally petitioned to delay their repatriation. The camp administrators were uncertain how to handle these requests. The legal framework for detention anticipated prisoners eager to return home, not prisoners afraid to leave. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Women who could demonstrate that returning to their home regions would pose immediate threat to their safety, those from areas now under Soviet control or from regions where infrastructure had completely collapsed, would be allowed to remain until alternative arrangements could be made. Greta was among those who qualified. Her hometown was now in the Soviet zone. She had no close family remaining. Her parents had been killed in an air raid in 1945, and her sister was barely surviving in the West. She had no home to return to, no prospects for employment, no reason to leave a place where she was fed and safe. The irony was not lost on her. She had become dependent on the very people who had destroyed her country, and this dependence was not coerced. It was freely chosen, the result of rational calculation about where survival was most likely. She remained at Camp Rustin until November 1946, when she was finally processed for repatriation to the British zone. On her last morning, she went to the mess hall for breakfast. The menu had not changed in 10 months. Scrambled eggs, bacon, bread, oatmeal, milk. She ate slowly, knowing it would be her last American breakfast for the foreseeable future. Around her, new detainees, recently arrived from processing centers in Europe, experienced the same shock she had felt nearly a year earlier. She watched their faces, saw the confusion and disbelief, and understood that she was witnessing the moment when ideology collided with material reality. The symbolism of scrambled eggs extended beyond Camp Rustin. In the broader context of American engagement with occupied Germany, food became a central element of the Reconstruction effort. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, allocated billions of dollars for European recovery, much of it designated for food imports and agricultural rehabilitation. American wheat, shipped across the Atlantic in quantities that would have seemed impossible just years earlier, fed millions of Germans who might otherwise have starved or turned to political extremism out of desperation. The contrast between American and Soviet approaches to occupation crystallized around food policy. In the Western zones, the Allies prioritized stability and recovery, recognizing that hungry populations were susceptible to communist ideology. In the Eastern Zone, the Soviets prioritized reparations and control, extracting resources and maintaining low ration levels to enforce compliance. The result was that Germans in the West, despite living among ruins, gradually experienced improvement in material conditions, while those in the East faced continued hardship. This material divide reinforced ideological divides. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949 in the Western zones, would build its identity around concepts of Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, that transformed a devastated nation into an industrial powerhouse within a generation. The German Democratic Republic in the East would struggle with chronic shortages and economic stagnation, eventually requiring walls and border guards to prevent its citizens from fleeing to the West. The women who passed through Camp Rustin carried with them the memory of scrambled eggs. Those who settled in West Germany would see similar abundance gradually manifest in their adopted homeland as Reconstruction progressed. Those who returned to the East would face continued scarcity and would remember the eggs as evidence of a different world, a world where systems worked and people were fed. The eggs became a kind of touchstone, a measure against which all subsequent political promises would be judged. Greta Hoffmann lived until 1987. She settled in a small town in Lower Saxony, worked as a clerk in a municipal office, married briefly in the 1950s, and spent her later years in quiet obscurity. In 1985, she was interviewed as part of an oral history project documenting the experiences of German civilians during the occupation. The interviewer, a young graduate student, asked her about her time at Camp Rustin. She spoke for nearly 3 hours. She described the barracks, the guards, the work assignments. She described the other women, particularly Anna Drescher, who had taken her own life in 1952, unable to reconcile her past convictions with the reality of what Germany had done and what it had become. She described the fear she had felt when first arriving at the camp and the confusion that had replaced that fear. And she described the scrambled eggs. "You have to understand," she said, "that I had been told all my life that we were the superior race, that we were destined to rule, that our enemies were weak and degenerate. And then I sat in a prison camp, eating eggs that were better than anything I had ever tasted, cooked by the same enemies who were supposed to be inferior to us. It broke something in my mind. Not immediately, it took time. But once it broke, I could not put it back together. I could not make myself believe the lies anymore." The interviewer asked if she resented the American hospitality, if she felt it was a form of manipulation. Greta considered the question carefully before answering. "No," she said, "it was not manipulation. It was simply what they had. They did not need to manipulate us. They just needed to show us the truth. And the truth was that we had fought for a lie, sacrificed for a lie, and built our entire nation on a foundation of lies. The Americans did not need to tell us this. They just needed to give us breakfast." The story of German women prisoners begging to stay after tasting scrambled eggs is not, in the end, a story about eggs. It is a story about the power of material reality to overwhelm ideology, about the fragility of belief systems built on deprivation and sacrifice, and about the profound psychological impact of abundance on people who have known only scarcity. The Third Reich promised its citizens glory, greatness, and a thousand-year empire. It delivered hunger, destruction, and utter ruin. The American system, flawed and imperfect as it was, promised little in the abstract but delivered scrambled eggs every morning, bacon when it was available, bread that was soft and white, milk that was cold and sweet. The contrast was not subtle. It did not require explanation. It simply existed, undeniable and overwhelming. In the decades after World War II, the ideological struggle between democratic capitalism and Soviet communism would be waged on many fronts: military, diplomatic, technological, cultural. But perhaps the most effective propaganda was never intended as propaganda at all. It was simply the daily experience of ordinary people comparing their lives across the Iron Curtain, measuring their own scarcity against reports of abundance in the West, and drawing their own conclusions about which system better served human flourishing. The women who tasted scrambled eggs at Camp Rustin in 1946 were witnesses to a fundamental truth about political systems. They are ultimately judged not by their rhetoric but by their results, not by their promises but by their deliveries, not by their ideology but by their capacity to provide for the basic needs of those they govern. The eggs were not a trick or a manipulation. They were simply eggs, abundant and available in a place where abundance was normal rather than exceptional. And that, more than any lecture on democracy or freedom, more than any re-education program or forced contrition, was what shattered the ideological certainty of women who had grown up believing in the superiority of a system that had fed them lies while starving them of everything else. The scrambled eggs at Camp Rustin were not the cause of Germany's transformation from totalitarian state to democratic society, but they were a symbol of that transformation, a small, mundane, overwhelming proof that the old lies would not survive contact with new truths. The women who ate those eggs and begged to stay were not weak or corrupted. They were simply human beings making rational decisions about where they could survive, where they could heal, where they could begin to rebuild lives shattered by a regime that had demanded everything and given nothing in return. In the end, freedom and democracy and human rights are abstract concepts, difficult to grasp and easy to dismiss when one has been taught to believe in something else. But scrambled eggs are concrete. You can taste them, smell them, feel them satisfy a hunger that goes beyond mere appetite. You can remember them when everything else becomes uncertain. And you can measure every subsequent political promise against the simple material fact that in one place, at one time, you were fed properly, treated decently, and shown through the most ordinary of kindnesses that the world you thought you knew was built on foundations of sand. The women of Camp Rustin carried that knowledge forward into lives lived in the shadow of Germany's crimes and in the light of its reconstruction. They carried the memory of scrambled eggs as evidence that things could be different, that systems could work, that abundance was possible, and that the lies they had been told about their enemies were perhaps the greatest lies of all. It was a small truth, delivered on a metal tray in a prison camp in Louisiana. But small truths, repeated daily, compounded over time, can undermine even the most elaborate ideological structures. Sometimes all it takes is breakfast.